Welcome. Welcome to part B on this, or the second part of this chapter 1 presentation, where I'm going to now kind of shift into looking at the foundations of psychology and some of the key ideas that sort of started this whole thing, and try to talk a little bit about this idea of what is developmental psychology and how does it fit within the context of the broader field of psychology, because it's not like people like Freud and Piaget and Erikson necessarily viewed themselves as developmental psychologists or is focused just on that. It's just that their ideas have such direct implication for our understanding of the developing brain that, well, and they're such giants in psychology in a broader sense. So one of the things I'm going to try to do with this presentation is set the stage a bit for kind of contextualizing or telling the story of where all this developmental psychology's roots are. All right, welcome. Hope you're doing well and having a decent week. Alrighty, I'm gonna just put all the points up at once. I was trying to go just as I'm going, but the last one I went on this like epic rant on this last slide, but then I didn't put on that development related to pleasure part, so it kind of messed it up. So I'm gonna do this again. Psychoanalytic theory, and I want you to think of this concept of like, what does this even mean that Freud's writing is. And I'll talk about Freud a lot during this course, and I was just going on this rant about how, like, they say about Greek philosophy that everyone after Plato's basically responding to Plato, and that's very true with relevant to Freud, that everyone's basically commenting on Freud, right? That so many of the key names in psychology were Freud students, whether we're talking about like Erikson or whether we're talking about Carl Jung or Carl Rogers or Viktor Frankl or even like Alfred Adler. And then there's the notable detractors, like even Otto Rank would be another one on that side, like people like Eric Fromm or Karen Horney. And so I'll talk about that a lot, like how he really kind of started this ball rolling on this idea that it seems like these people, because remember, he's this medical doctor that's having people come to him and describe things that we would now call related to anxiety disorders and mental health related stuff, but that didn't seem to present a physical issue. And he's saying, so there's got to be something like kind of under the waters going on here, something in the software. And so he's looking at how development is heavily influenced by these unconscious processes that influence our emotion. So just think of what that would mean. That like our emotions, he says that basically, like, and I'm getting a little bit ahead, but he's saying basically that like early childhood stuff happens, and because the mind is so young, it's not processed the same way as it would as an adult. And so but the energy and the tension from that stays, and it kind of, if it's not dealt with, manifests in adulthood as like a more generalized anxiety. And he had this idea that the behavior associated with that is just like a reflection. So it says there, like, behavior is a surface characteristic. It's like he thought that behavior was very much a manifestation or a reflection of what's going on inside the person. And so, and again, so remember, Freud's starting to bridge this gap between philosophy and science. And he's starting to talk about the mind. He's talking about it in philosophical ways, but in ways that are starting to try to get at the dynamic of what's actually going on. And that's why sometimes you'll hear it referred to as psychodynamics. And it's like, that's a good word, because I sometimes say to students that dynamic is basically just a group of things that are connected in a complicated way, and so that dynamic, the dynamic interactions of all your emotional systems and memory and goals and desires and fears, that whole dynamic, and that dynamic's heavily influenced by things like sexuality and aggression. It says that, like, the true understanding of development requires an analysis of meaning of behavior, the symbolic meaning of behavior, what meaning, like what you can read into why somebody's doing the things that they're doing, or why we're doing the things that we're doing. And this like deep analysis of the mind, this psychoanalysis. So I wanted to throw this in here too, right? So on that last slide, I had the picture of like the tree with the reflection of the tree in the water much bigger, and it's sort of symbolic of the same idea, right? That like Freud often referred to the unconscious as like an iceberg. And I think that's like a fitting metaphor, right? And you've probably heard this before. If you've taken any psychology class, they probably talked about Freud. They probably talked about the iceberg. But the idea is actually super, super deep, that the part of your mind that's conscious, that you could tell me about, your thinking mind, is only a part of the story. And there's things that have happened to you and experiences that you've had and emotions and relationship issues and all these kind of things that you couldn't necessarily name, but are still influencing you and are still observable in your behavior. And that's actually a really deep insight. It's actually the fundamental insight of psychology.
Being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise. Dr. Sigmund Freud. I'm in the original European Inner World Masters Psychoanalysis home office, sitting in a reclining chair where Dr. Sigmund Freud analyzed patients from between 1891 and 1938. A psychoanalyst's couch, like the one Freud's patients lay on in search of relief from inner world turmoil, is stretched out in front of me. I'm writing step 4 to you from Vienna, Austria. Imagine how the Victorian era Viennese public must have reacted when Dr. Freud first introduced the idea to the world that our behaviors are driven by all sorts of things that occurred in our past, and which are often not at all conscious to us in the present. Over 100 years ago, that culture-rattling insight changed the course of history. Foremost, because it changed the way we understand how our self develops. Dr. Freud recognized that we're each exposed to formative experiences and insights, and that although we may have forgotten those important events, they are continuing to inform the moment-to-moment recreation of our self, and so how we feel and express ourselves each moment today. Dr. Freud taught us that many of the experiences that influence how our self is produced today occurred before we were able to form lasting conscious memories at all. Although all of our life's experiences cannot necessarily be brought into our conscious awareness as memories today, Dr. Freud saw that they often left a lasting impact on how we behave and what automatic emotions we experience throughout life. Unconscious experiences derived from early life events influence your habits, choices, and behaviors throughout your life. Your unconscious history form the iterations of yourself that rise off your bridge of translation today. Dr. Freud observed that moments of challenge or trauma often continued to grow within and emerged in a morphed form as emotions and behaviors later in life. He saw that some seeds planted flower over time, while other seeds grow in decay. Either way, unconsciously planted seeds often morph into new aspects of your life by changing the moment-to-moment contents automatically occurring in your inner dialogue, and so becoming the different versions of yourself each moment.
Another important psychologist we're going to be looking at a lot in this course, and you don't necessarily have to have this written down, this part, but I thought it's just interesting to kind of, and this is obviously just an image from the internet, but it's interesting to kind of break this down that, like, first of all, I find it always interesting to think a little bit about who these people were as like humans, and that, like, it's kind of interesting that he was really good friends with Freud's daughter. And so Erikson, this guy that's basically going to become the most referenced child psychologist, child developmental psychologist, except maybe Piaget. He wasn't even trained in it originally. He was friends with Freud's daughter. He was going through the stuff himself. He thought he would try this psychoanalysis stuff. He actually got a lot of benefit from it. He sort of dedicated his life to it. By the end of his career, he's teaching psychology at Harvard and Yale. So he has actually quite an interesting story of how he came to value and came to understand things, and came to understand this idea that our psychology and our social world is heavily connected. And I'm going to just continue talking about that on the next slide. Yeah, so super interesting guy, Erikson. Sorry, so just to continue on that rant for a sec. Okay. Sorry, I just have to get everything on the screen so then I can just talk and then I can just save this slide. I haven't made recordings for students for a while, so I'm kind of like, since like last year and all this, it just seems a bit different. I'm just kind of reteaching myself recording in PowerPoint, so I apologize that I'm like talking about it a bit and that it's like not cleaner, but I'll get it better as we go. Humans develop in psychosocial stages. So this is like Erikson's huge insight that you have to almost view the mind as, it's almost like this is like almost a nature-nurture conversation where he's saying that basically your nature gets nurtured through this series of stages that, and you could also call that just like you developing. Right, and I said this in the last presentation, but it's worth hearing a few times, right? That a species evolves over time, but within one lifespan, any one organism develops from birth to death. So development's looking at how you change through your lifespan, and it's obviously heavily influenced by like the people that come before you and stuff like that. But we're looking sort of specifically at this idea of how does age affect the pressures society's putting on you, right? So he's saying like in the same way later in the course we're going to talk about how like when you're a teenager there's all this pressure around like identity, and there's pressure like establishing who you are and who you aren't and how you fit into things. And when you're in a young adult you have a lot of pressure around you around like relationships and around how you're gonna, he would say, establishing intimacy and trying to avoid isolation. He says this all starts at childhood, it all starts at birth, it all starts with this like infant trying to establish a trusting relationship with mom, and that's actually the most foundational relationship in the universe, that the baby's immediate task, the first pressure it's under, is to form a sustaining relationship with mom, and that its a success in doing that or lack thereof has a huge effect. And if a baby's able to do it successfully and is able to trust mom's responsiveness, that sense of trust actually like carries with that child later and becomes a model of how to interact in future relationships. So really, if you've ever heard anyone say like, oh, this guy I'm dating has trust issues, he doesn't want to like settle down or something, it's like that person probably doesn't realize, but they're using Erikson language, right? They're saying that because this person failed to establish a relationship of trust while breastfeeding, literally, or while feeding as an infant, because it kind of is more than just feeding. It's like feeding, being changed, and being comforted and loved. Those three things. You know, it's usually like hug me, like comfort me, change me, feed me, is like kind of the three main requests from a baby. And if a baby doesn't establish that relationship, it's not like they just don't have trust. They actually, Erikson warns, like, no, it's not like it's nice to have this thing, and if you don't have it, you just don't have it. It's like, no. If you don't have it, there's actually this tendency to develop a deep mistrust. And that's different than just not trusting. It's like a cynicism. It's like a lack of, well, and it kind of makes sense if your original relationships teach you that you can't depend on people, then that carries forward into future relationships, is Erikson's idea. And so he was saying that that's the main challenge at infancy. And then like a main challenge at, I kind of touched on this, but a main challenge in the stage that a lot of you are in is this idea of like, who are you going to spend your time with, and how are you going to develop relationships of depth? And he would say like you could be in a relationship, you could even be like in a sexual relationship with someone and still have it characterized by psychological isolation. That depth, physical connection doesn't necessarily imply depth, although it certainly can. Right? So he was saying that like, the reason I included those is just because those are like two very different life. It's basically like looking at your life when you're 1 or like less than 1 when you're a newborn versus like when you're 20, and that who you are as a being is being pressured by society in different ways based on your age. And your psychology and your social world are different. They're not even different sides of the same coin. They're almost the same thing. But it's again, it's getting caught in the language of nature nurture. It's like basically you're a thing that develops in a world. And so the world that you develop in obviously influences you, but also obviously who you are also influences that development. So again, a dynamic, a complicated interlocking of ideas. So then for the next group of psychologists I want to talk about, and there's a presentation actually on this channel if anyone's like interested. There's one you can find that's called The History of Therapeutic Psychology, where I do like a much deeper dive into all of these individual people, because I feel like I'm kind of only touching on these names right now, and I know you've heard of some of these. I know you've probably heard of Skinner and his rats, and I'm going to tell you more about that as we move forward. And you've heard of Pavlov and his dogs. You probably didn't know that Pavlov also experimented a lot on children. I'll talk about that. But what is the main thing? You could, if you're writing some of the what's down in the gray, that'd be great. That development results from behaviors learned through interaction with the surroundings. That there was this next like wave of psychologists, and this is when psychology is getting much more like experimental and moving into the labs of different universities. And you got the rise of this like behavioralism, whether you're talking about like Harry Harlow and his monkeys, or whether you're talking about like Pavlov and his dogs, or Skinner and his rats and his pigeons. You see this real turn into like caring a lot less about, and like on purpose less, right? Like Erickson would even be critical of, not Erickson, sorry, like someone like Skinner would even be critical of someone like Freud, who would, and say that he would be spending too much time like worrying about the childhood of people. Like if you want to understand people, just observe their behavior, observe what changes their behavior, observe how rewards can alter behavior, observe how punishment can alter behavior, right? So I say they're behavioralism, or scientifically only what can be directly observed and measured. So that's worded a little bit weird, but it's like this idea of, to understand the thing, you need to observe it and you need to measure it. You basically need to study the behavior. Notice how this is like, so behaviorism, it's focused on this idea that if I can to understand you, I need to understand what makes you do the things you do, how to alter that, how to reinforce that. And this is where you get ideas like classical conditioning, which I'm going to show you a video on in a sec. And then also this idea of operant conditioning. So classical conditioning is basically Pavlov. Operant conditioning is basically just the ideas of Skinner. Now this is all even more interesting because these guys are both associated with war efforts at the time, right? Because this is all tensions between Russia and states. Pavlov's a Russian psychologist. Erickson is heavily associated with the U.S. military at the time. So there's so many layers to all of this stuff that I hope you find kind of interesting. Okay, I got a little video next for you.
Behavioral psychologists have come up with new views, not only of animal behavior, but of human nature as well. And these views all concern a process that we take for granted, learning, because we are all truly born to learn. Ironically, one of the most important figures in the study of learning, Ivan Pavlov, wasn't concerned with the subject at all, at least not at first. Pavlov, a noted Russian scientist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904. As this original footage shows, Pavlov was initially interested in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dogs salivated quickly, an inherited salivary reflex. But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dogs salivated before contact with the food. Just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants, was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way. Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic unlearned response. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned. Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and a response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened. Pavlov's work, and the work of those who followed him, led to a remarkable conclusion, and that is, any stimulus an organism can perceive is capable of eliciting any reaction the organism is capable of making. This means that virtually any sound, sight, or smell can influence the way our muscles tense or relax, our moods fluctuate, or even the way our attitudes are formed. For instance, if I say, relax, and then do this, you're going to be startled and upset. After 5 or 6 pairings of relax, just saying the word relax is going to generate a negative response rather than its usual learned reaction.
One way I like to teach about psychology is to look at it as basically being these 5 big waves, or these 5 kind of schools of thinking. And the first one being the psychoanalyst, the first one being like Freud and his students. So that's like Freud and Anna Freud and Carl Rogers, I guess. Although he's in another category too. I meant to say Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, Otto Rank, and people like this, and even some of his detractors, like people like Eric Fromm or Karen Horney. And then there's this next group of sometimes called learning theorists, sometimes called behavioralist, which is like your Edward Thorndike and Watson and Skinner and Pavlov. And then there's this third group, this cognitive theorists, and I'll come back to that in a sec. And this is going to be like Piaget, Vygotsky, some guys like that. Then in terms of the next kind of major one, or the fourth one, you don't have to necessarily be writing this down, but just so you know, is like growth psychology, right? So that's where, and sometimes that's called like the humanistic psychology, and that includes like Maslow and Frankl and Carl Rogers, Rollo May. And then the last one is this whole influence of like biological psychology, kind of spearheaded by people like Gazelle, and around topics like genetics and how genetics plays into this. So these are the kind of 5 big things. And so one of them is cognitive. And if at your school there's probably like second or third year psych classes called cognitive psychology, and if you were to take a cognitive psychology class, you'd be talking about stuff like this, like how we process language, how our brain gets involved in like advanced thinking and problem solving, how memory works, how attention works, things like intelligence and perception. But the easiest way to think about it is cognitive basically means the work that your brain does, right? So it's like the cognitive theorists are now much less interested just in your behavior, much more interested in why you're doing what you're doing, what's going on between your ears. How are you actually processing things? How are you thinking about things? How are you using your intelligence, language, thinking, problem solving, memory, attention, and perception to try to understand your world and act in it? And so notice the switch is now from your behavior to your processing of it, your cognition. So one of Piaget's big ideas, and you don't have to copy down this table or anything, I'm about to show you a video that kind of explains it nicely, and we're going to break it down as we get into the course, but one of the main ideas that he had is just this idea that a 6-month-old's not just a not as smart 4-year-old. Their brains are completely different. They're not processing things the same, right? When you play peekaboo with a kid that's young enough, and you drop down, you're like coming in and out of their experience. Once a kid gets to a certain age and you go to play peekaboo with them, it's like my daughter will just pull my hands down, like, Daddy, what are you doing? It's like, to them, it's not a game anymore. Their mind's made that jump. Their mind understands something that's called object permanence, which we'll talk about later, that it basically just means that things are permanent even when you're not aware of it, that like, that I still exist and this chair in this room exists even though you don't see me until next week's recording. It's like, to you as an adult, you're like, yeah, no kidding. But the baby not understanding that is the exact reason why peekaboo works and why it doesn't work after a certain age. And Piaget would say, well, that's because the baby switched from sensory motor to pre-operational. It's processing differently. It's not just more or less. It's a whole like level switch. So let's look at this idea with this next video. And again, don't worry about like learning the whole Piaget model, because these are just 2 different pictures representing the model. It's basically, you could write down this idea that there's 4 stages: sensory motor 0 to 2, pre-operational, so like not yet really able to manipulate and perform operations, less advanced, pre-operational, and then concrete operational, so it's more advanced but more black and white, concrete. And then formal operational allows for this more abstract, higher end thinking that we start to reach when we're kind of getting close to the teen years. So again, that was like a super quick freestyled way of explaining it, but basically the key point I want you to have is that it's like leveling up. It's not just more. It's not like it's like 10%, 40%, 80%. It's like not like that kind of quantitative way of looking at it doesn't make sense. The brain of a baby is basically in a dream state. It's very different than yours. All right, now I'll talk about that more later. I've said that about 1,000,000 times in this presentation, but it's because this is like the intro presentation, right?
Piaget's theory argues that we have to conquer 4 stages of cognitive development. First, the sensory motor stage. Second, the pre-operational stage. Third, the concrete operational stage. And fourth, the formal operational stage. Only once we have gone through all the stages, at what age can vary, we are able to reach full human intelligence. 1. The sensory motor stage, ages birth to 2. In the sensory motor stage, we develop through experiences and movement our 5 senses. Our brain wants to see, hear, smell, taste and touch as much as possible. First, we start with simple reflexes, and soon after we develop our first habits. From 4 months old, we become aware of things beyond our own body, and then as we get older, we learn to do things intentionally. A key milestone is the development of working memory, or in Piaget terms, our realization of object permanence. Before that, our mum can show and then hide a teddy, and we would think it's gone. After, we understand that objects continue to exist even when we can't see them. We start becoming curious about everything. We want to smell flowers, taste food, listen to sounds, and talk to strangers. To explore more, we move. We learn to sit, crawl, stand, walk, and even to run. This increased physical mobility consequently leads to increased cognitive development. But we remain egocentric, meaning we can perceive the world only from our own point of view. 2. The pre-operational stage, ages 2 to 7. Our thinking is mainly categorized through symbolic functions and intuitive thoughts. We have lots of fantasies and believe objects are alive. As we are not able to apply specific cognitive operations, Piaget calls this stage pre-operational. We learn to speak and understand that words, images, and gestures are symbols for something else. When we draw our family, we are not concerned about drawing each person to scale, but rather with their symbolic meanings. We love to play pretend, which allows us to experience something new and learn a lot. At around age 4, most of us become very curious and ask many questions. We want to know everything. We can call it the birth of primitive reasoning. Piaget calls it the intuitive age, because while we realize that we have a vast amount of knowledge, we have no idea how we acquired it. Our thinking in this stage is still pretty egocentric. We think others see the world like we do, and still don't understand that they see it differently. 3. The concrete operational stage, ages 7 to 11. We finally discover logic and we develop concrete cognitive operations, such as sorting objects in a certain order. One example of this is inductive reasoning, which means that if we see someone eating a cookie, we can draw a conclusion and then make a generalization. And we now get the concept of conservation. We understand that if we pour orange juice from a normal glass to a taller one, the amount stays the same. Our younger sister will pick the taller glass, thinking she gets more. By the same logic, we only now can understand that if 3 plus 5 equals 8, then 8 minus 3 must equal 5. Our brain learns to rearrange our thoughts, to classify and build concrete operational mental structures. For example, we now know that we can reverse an action by doing the opposite. Excited by our new mental abilities, we apply them in conversations, activities, when we learn to write, and in school. As a result, we get to know ourselves better. We begin to understand that our thoughts and feelings are unique and not necessarily those of others. That means that we learn to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. 4. The formal operational stage, age 12 plus. Once we become teenagers, we become formally operational. We now have the ability to think more rationally about abstract concepts and hypothetical events. Our advanced cognitive abilities allow us to understand abstract concepts such as success and failure, love and hate. We form a deeper understanding of our own identity and our morality. We now also think that we understand why people behave the way they behave, and as a result, can become more compassionate. Our brain can now do deductive reasoning, which means we can compare two statements and reach a logical generalization. Our new mental skills allow us to plan our life systematically and prioritize, and we can make assumptions about events that have no necessary relation to reality. We can now also philosophize and just think about thinking itself. Our new sense for our identity now also creates egocentric thoughts, and some start to see an imaginary audience watching them all the time. Piaget believed in lifelong learning, but insisted that the formal operational stage is the final stage of our cognitive development. Jean Piaget's first interests were animals, and he published his first scientific paper on albino sparrows in 1907, when he was just 11 years old. In 1920, he began working with standardized intelligence tests. He realized that younger children consistently make types of mistakes that older children do not. He concluded that they must think differently and spent the rest of his life studying the intellectual development of children.
So if you look at this, it's like this notion that cognitive theory is related to or interested in conscious thought, right? So if you think about what does that mean, well, it's less interested in or less focused on these kind of underlying like Freudian psychodynamics. It's more focused on like what are you actually thinking of? How is the way that you're judging your own behavior while on a first date affecting your ability to actually have an interesting conversation with someone else? That would be an example of a cognitive theory question. How, and again, that's more of like adult related obviously, but it's this idea of like how is the way you're making sense of it affecting your performance? How is your cognition, right? How is the child constructing an understanding of themselves, right? And what, we're going to talk about this later, because by the time a child's about 5, they sort of have this model of what relationships are and how valuable they are that then gets played out in all these other situations once they go to school. What's it even mean to say a child has an internal model of who they are and what relationships are and how they're supposed to act? And right, that's like a very, it's easy to say that. That's like a, if someone's really pushing you and being like, well, what does that mean? What does it mean that a child has an internal understanding of who they are? Well, it's a very complicated thought. Like who they are is a very complicated thought. They're engaged in this kind of personal process of development. Piaget noted, and I'll tell you way more about Piaget because he's really interesting, because a lot of he actually worked with a guy named Simon Binet. I'm going to tell you about this in a lot of detail later, who developed the IQ test, and Piaget's job was to write down the answers that people got wrong, and he started to notice that kids got answers wrong in predictable ways based on their age. So like when a 4-year-old would get a question wrong, they tended to make the same flavor of mistake, and that it seemed to be a different kind of mistake than 6-year-olds who got the question wrong, and almost as if they're processing the situation differently. And this is sort of where some of his ideas come, that like children's cognition is qualitatively different in each stage, which is just a fancy way of saying it's not more or less. It's like a total different thing. I'm going to show you some interesting experiments and examples of how to show these 4 stages of development. So this next idea, and I'm not sure, depending on how many psychology courses you've taken, you may have heard of this idea of the zone of proximal development before. And this is the work of a guy named Vygotsky, who, if you're following along with the PowerPoint, the spelling for his name's on the next slide. But Vygotsky has this idea that your learning and your development is so, he calls it like, like I can just see the next slide because I'm recording it in PowerPoint. He calls it like social cultural, right? So the combination of the words social and cultural. And so socio-cultural or whatever. But basically he's just saying that like the cultural social situation is so, shapes the developmental potential of the individual. There's like what you are. So you're basically the blue circle. And that's what you could do with no help. My daughter can read at a certain level completely by herself. If I help her with the hard words and I help her make sense of what a few phrases or random sayings or whatever mean, all of a sudden she can read actually a couple levels higher, right? So it's an example I like to use because it tends to make sense to people. It's like when my daughter started playing Minecraft. She likes Minecraft, right? And she would play and she'd be able to play, but then there would be pop-ups that would come up that would be like text, not like from other people, but just like within the game. Or she'd go to do something and it would involve, she could play the game, but it would involve reading that was sort of above her level. So if I was sitting there doing some work or whatever on the laptop, or playing with her, I could just like tell her that. All of a sudden she navigates through that and she can reach like, and she can get better and better and better, right? She's not like immediately stopped by the one thing. And this is like, that Minecraft example is the same reason that like reading buddies are so effective with kids, that they mirror that next step and they can help them over those little hurdles that would stop them. So basically the idea is there's how much you can do, and then there's how much you can do with skilled help, and those are different. and the difference is the zone of development. So it's like, okay, now apply that to like any kind of situation where you're like training or raising a kid, where it's like there's what the kid's capable of, there's what the kid could do. It's almost like what the kid has inbuilt, right? Again, it's just like another complicated way of talking about nature nurture. There's the nature, and then what nurture does is it's almost a field of possibility. So it's like how much that nature or that person could develop in the best possible learning scenario, and that's a different level of development, and there's a space in between that, right? And that, so basically his idea is that that's where learning happens. Learning is that distance between what you are and what you could be getting smaller, either through the help of knowledgeable other people or through the use of like certain technologies or whatever. Yeah, but the key point is proximity means distance. So it's the zone of distance that's related to development, means the distance between what I can do and what I could do with help, and how well my help is at mirroring that next step and being socially, culturally involved in my development. So I'll give you some notes on this on the next slide. So Vygotsky, and I would call him probably, I think I already said this on another slide, so I apologize, but he's probably the most famous Russian psychologist. There's a lot, and I think I was ranting about how Pavlov was like, he's probably the first name that people think of, but like technically he wasn't really a psychologist, even though his findings are highly relevant for psychology. He was more interested in this salivation of dogs. He was a physiologist. So Vygotsky's social cultural, that thing I was going on to talk about last slide, cognitive theory. So that, now that's a tongue twister, but Vygotsky's obviously just the guy's last name. Social cultural means how the context, the nurture, affects cognition, how we think. That culture and social interaction guide cognitive development, that our mind, almost our thinking mind, develops in the social world, that the development of the child, you can't separate that from their social cultural activities or their situation, their nurture. Cognitive development is learning to use the inventions of society, things like language and how to use your memory, and how to like learn how to better use your memory, and how to do things like math. And that actually interactions with either older siblings or interactions with peers at school or with teachers or with adults and coaches can play a huge role in shaping that, because the zone of proximal development is also like super important from a coaching psychology perspective. It's basically high-end coaching is, or just coaching in general of any kind, is completely focused on this zone of proximal development. Where's the person at? Where could they be at if placed in the most growth promoting, flourishing environmental context, nurture, and then trying to build those steps in whatever way makes sense to whatever like sport or training activity we're talking about. Musical training, raising a kid, all these things, teaching a kid how to read. So it's more, I said raising a kid, but more specific to like skill development.
Vygotsky's theory of social development argues that community and language play a central part in learning, while Jean Piaget concluded that children's cognitive development happens in stages. Vygotsky rejected his ideas and believed that children develop independently of specific stages as the result of social interactions. Vygotsky claimed that we are born with 4 elementary mental functions: attention, sensation, perception, and memory. It is our social and cultural environment that allows us to use these elementary skills to develop and finally gain higher mental functions. This development ideally happens in the zone of proximal development. First, there is what we can do on our own. Then there is the zone of proximal development, which represents what we can do with the help of an adult, a friend, technology, or what Vygotsky called the more knowledgeable other. Last, there is what's beyond our reach. To illustrate this, let us think of twins who were raised in a community in which boys are expected to learn and succeed, while girls are only expected to be pretty. At the age of 10 months, both have the ability to crawl and are in the zone of proximal development for learning how to stand on their feet. The more knowledgeable other, in this case the father, provides the boy with opportunities to practice in a playroom that he has equipped with scaffolding and other objects. The boy is encouraged to explore the equipment, and eventually he uses it to pull himself up. A few hours later, he's cruising along the structures, and a few days later, he's standing on his feet. The girl also has the potential to stand, but does not receive any support in learning the skill. When we compare the two, we see that while the girl is still trying to get up, the boy has moved into a new zone. He knows how to balance while standing and now has the potential to learn how to walk. Both will eventually learn how to walk, but according to Vygotsky, the boy will be more skilled. The same principles apply to all learning and the development of higher cognitive functions, and only those learning with the assistance of a capable mentor can reach the full potential of their ability. Vygotsky therefore believed that inside the zone of proximal development, learning can precede development, which means that a child is able to learn skills that go beyond their natural maturity. He also established an explicit connection between speech and mental concepts, arguing that inner speech develops from external speech via a gradual process of internalization. This means that thought itself develops as a result of conversation. Therefore, younger children who don't finish this process can only think out loud. Once the process is complete, inner speech and spoken language become independent. Lev Vygotsky died of tuberculosis in 1934 at the age of 37. Despite his young age, he became one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century. He left the following advice for educators. By giving students practice in talking with others, we give them frames for thinking on their own. What do you think? Can a child learn anything regardless of any developmental prerequisites? And do we learn only through social and cultural contexts? And if so, do you think it is appropriate for a more knowledgeable other to determine what a child should learn next? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
If you like this video and the way we explain the subject, subscribe to our channel. We try to explain complex subjects in simple language and cartoons to support students all around the world in their learning. If you want to support us, you can go to www.patreon.com/sprouts and donate. Just $1 from many fans makes a big difference.
This time period, also now you're getting into like the 40s, 50s, 60s, these initial computers. I know it's not like internet yet, but this way of thinking of like how computers work and how files are stored and how files are accessed, and you can see this language creep into the field of psychology. And I'm going to show you this on the next slide, this idea of like looking at the brain as something that processes information. It's like it's an information processing system, right? When you can see how like that language sounds very computerish, and it's not surprising that the people that came up with that language came up with it in the era where computing was like kind of the new buzz, right, that people were interested in, like kind of how social media or something might be like the thing now. Early, this is like, so I think like just, I don't know, that's kind of, I don't think it's here nor there, because I think it is actually directly relevant. It's like that the development of the field of psychology was taking place in a changing world, you know, that went through with World War I and World War II and the Cold War, and was heavily influenced by the development of computers and the developments in bioscience around genetics, and all those things were like heavily connected. Okay, so information processing theory. So just for like your notes, this idea that it's starting to look at how people basically process information, right? Like how you manipulate information, how if I tell you something, how you think about that thing, remember it, and then maybe prepare to like write about it later or answer a question about it later. It's like that whole processing of that information. How do you do that? What's actually, and remember, this is like under the umbrella of cognitive psychology, right? So this kind of shift away from psychoanalytic or behavioral focus to this shift on the cognition, the between the ears part of existence, that development, and this is kind of pushed back towards Piaget, like some people in the information processing theory argue the stage model a bit of Piaget, and think that individuals gradually increasing capacities to process information. It's not necessarily stages, it is just stronger, stronger, stronger. I think that, in my opinion, the truth is somewhere in the middle. I think kids definitely go through stages, but then in certain areas, like maybe in terms of specifically like the information processing related to memory recall, it is something that's just sort of getting stronger. So getting caught in the like, is it stage like, or is it just a growing thing? So basically the idea, is it like steps, or is it just like a straight line? It kind of depends what you're talking about, right? In terms of processing social situations, it seems like it's more the Piaget way. In terms of like just straight memory power, it seems like it's a little more just like 10%, 11%, 12%, whatever, right? Like more linear is a way you'd say it, or more quantitative. Individuals develop gradually. Oh, I already read that. Okay, next slide. So then another, Bandura is difficult to place because he sort of bridges a gap between behavioralism and what you'd call like cognitive, because he's looking at this idea that not all behavior is just learned in a like Pavlovian or Skinner kind of way, like in either just like classical conditioning or operant conditioning, that obviously you learn a lot by like watching other people. The example I've always used is like, if this works better in a class, if I like have somebody that's like kind of fun to interact with, and I'm like, hey Carlos, I'm just thinking of a student that was hilarious. I'm like, if you saw me go and like stick a fork into that outlet and get like shocked across the room, and then I'm like, here Carlos, you go do it, it's like, would you do it? And he's like, no way. It's like, of course we see people do things and behave in reaction to that. And like the more positive, more like normal way of talking about that is like by using a word like role models, right? That we are influenced by the interactions with others, that our behavior is influenced by our environment, but at the same time our behavior then influences our environment. What that means is like, if you're aggressive towards everyone, that's actually going to change how they interact towards you. So it's not just your environment affecting you, you're also actively adding into the mix. And he says that there's almost this like conceptual benefit of looking at it like a relationship between yourself, your behavior, and your world. Another way you could, like it says in that model, like your person cognition, so like who you are and how you think, how you behave, and your environment, your world, your nurture. So you could almost look at person, if you want to go back to this nature nurture, and I think it's useful because I think it's useful to keep in mind that a lot of these things are more specific ways of saying nature, nurture, that like the nature would be person cognition, the nurture would be the environment, the behavior would be some dynamic manifestation coming from the two, right? That like what you're doing is some combination of who you are and where you are. That's a decent freestyle line. Who you are and where you are. Nature and nurture, basically, right? Cognitive processes are linked to the environment and behavior. Okay, ethological theory. This word means, well, they're like the study of the behavior of animals in their natural habitat. But even more so, a lot of times in relation, and that is what it is, it's the study of animal behavior. And actually, usually in their natural habitat, like how animals tend to function, right? And this gets into a look at like how certain ideas or certain behavioral patterns or certain relationship patterns that happen in animals are almost like models for things that happen in humans. And since some of these animals are more simple, the effects are more simple cognitively, the effects are more pronounced. So an example of that would be something like how one example I use is often used as like a duck. And when I'm doing this class in person, I'll often ask like, have any of you ever had a duck for a pet? And I guarantee you out there, someone email me if you have, because that'd be hilarious. But almost always, if it's a decent sized class, at least one person has had a duck for a pet. And that always makes everyone laugh, because people are always surprised to hear that people have a duck as a pet. But the reason why you can have a duck as a pet is because they prime, right? So what that means is that like, if mom's not around, that duck will prime to a human. And prime, I'm using the wrong word. Imprint. I'm sorry, I don't know why I was saying prime. It'll imprint, like IMPRINT. It'll put itself in. So it basically, imprinting basically means that the baby's born built to attach the label of mom to whatever moves, right? So they've done experiments, you can find this online easily on YouTube, where they've made like a cat. If a cat's the only thing in the presence of a duck when the duck's first born, it'll start to follow the cat around, or it'll start to follow a rabbit around, or it'll start to follow a remote control car. It'll even start to follow a balloon that bounces around the room, right? Because its brain is designed to immediately attach. The survival of the species depends on it attaching to mom and following mom immediately. And because mom is almost always duck, it doesn't, distinguishing between different potential moms is less important than just following mom. And why that's so interesting is because if you were to take a duck that's just born and separate it and have it for, I think it's like 2 weeks, basically by itself, it will never develop that need for mom again. It'll suffer all kinds of negative outcomes related to that, but it'll actually methanate the connection in the brain. It'll actually like chemically stop the impulse to be with mom. And they've actually found, so basically that's my example of something that's like a critical or a sensitive period. It's this specific time frame during which the presence or absence of a certain experience can have these long-lasting effects. They've done similar experiments with mice where they've taken mice away from the mom. And the mice, if you look at their brains, the mice are basically freaking out, wanting their mom for a certain amount of time. And then there's actually a chemical process that happens in the brain that reduces that need for mom. It's pretty intense. So before I start into this slide, I just want to clarify on that last slide. I said that they'll need their mom if the mouse is separated long enough. The neurochemistry in their brain will actually cut off that signal, and so the mouse won't need mom anymore. And that's where I misspoke a bit, 'cause the mouse still absolutely needs its mom. It will convince itself that it doesn't need its mom. And so I wanted to make the distinction that the mouse losing because it's so painful for it to not have mom when it needs mom, it stops itself from having the pain of not having mom. But that's not actually the same as not needing mom. It desperately needs mom. Not having mom is linked to all kinds of negative outcomes. Okay. So Bronfenbrenner's model is actually pretty interesting, and it like almost looks more complicated than it is. It's saying that, again, this is like another psychologist that likes to have a model. Psychologists love their theories in a picture. And I think that this is actually kind of interesting, right? It's saying that, like, who are you really? You're actually this like kind of complicated dynamic. There's you in the middle. You're that individual with whatever gender, age, health, status, and then around you are like the people that are closest to you. That's like your family, maybe your school friends, your peers, the people you play around with in the neighborhood. This is obviously like kind of aimed at a younger kid. Maybe the church group you go to, maybe the health services. And then all those systems interact because, like, and that's what mesosystem means. I'm going to do a slide on each that explains each one, but I'm just giving a quick overview. So all meso means in between. So micro means the small level, meso means in between, macro means big level, exo means kind of it's the same root word as exoskeleton, the skeleton of it. So it's basically like anyways, we don't have to keep going and breaking down the Latin, but basically the idea is that there's you in the middle, who you are, the individual, like represented there by the orange, and then there's the people that are closest to you. So there's you, and then there's all the people that are like closest to you, but all the people that are closest to you also are engaged in relationship, right? Like that's the interesting thing. It's like I have a relationship with my wife, and I have a relationship with my two daughters, but my daughters also have relationship with each other. They also both have an individual relationship with my mom, and me and Evie and my wife have a certain interaction pattern, and me and Charlotte, my wife, might have an interaction pattern, and all four of us might have an interaction pattern, and they might be different when I'm not there, and we might be different when my wife's not there. And it's like that, those are all the dynamics just within four people. And all that, so that's me trying to explain what mesosystem means, like the system within the system. And that's all surrounded by like our neighbors and, you know, the kind of society you live in, friends and family, the media you're exposed to. And then that's all contained within like this idea of a macro system, or the more general ideas and ideologies and brainwashing of the society at the time. And then chronosystem is this idea that, and all of that, so there's you, the people around you, how that all interacts, the broader community you're in, the broader kind of social story that you're living in, and then all of that exists within time too, right? Chrono is like the same, it's the Roman or Greek god of Roman, I think, god of time, Chronos. It's like chronological, tell it in order. It's time within the universe. Anon is time without the universe, A-I-O-N. You don't need to know any of that. I just am a bit of a nerd about Greek and Roman history, but anyways, a lot of the words we use in English are like root worded in Latin. So chronos means time. So you can just think of that as how to remember that part. Anyways, that was, if I was just able to edit these easier, I might cut out that last 30-second rant, but I think I did a decent job doing this overview of it. So now I'll kind of break down each piece. Alright, so then the micros, if you wonder why I like press the button a couple times then look to the side, it's like on the side it tells me, if you've ever recorded a presentation, it's like what the next point is, and then once I have like this individual is passive, once I have that last point down, it shows the next slide. So I basically just click until I can see the start of the next slide, and then I don't touch it again until I'm done. Because for every slide you see me record, maybe for every 2 slides I record, there's one that I drop. Maybe it's even not even that good. Maybe it's 1 for 1. Anyways, the microsystem. That's why when doing a long presentation, recording it in PowerPoint actually is pretty sweet because you can do it slide by slide. As you've seen, I've been through like 4 or 5 shirt switches during this presentation. I've done it over, well, really, I recorded some of it Tuesday, some of it yesterday, some of it today, Thursday. So Mike, you're a minute in, get to the point. The micro system, right? So now we're the first kind of circle, I don't know what color to call that, beige, I guess, that's around the orange middle, right? So there's you, and then there's the most immediate people in your environment, because you're influenced by everyone in your life. But obviously, like the store clerk at the shortstop near your house, which is a weird example for me to pick because I go there quite a bit, and the person there is nice. But like they influence my life obviously way less than like, I don't know, my wife or like even like my brother or someone like that, right? So it's like obviously we all know that the people that influence us don't all have the same amount of influence, and that our most direct interactions are the ones that have the most direct effect on things like our mental health and just our overall quality of life. So this is talking about things like our family, our peers, our school. Individuals is a, yeah, so that's a kind of weird sentence, right? The individual is a passive recipient of experiences, but also constructs the setting. So it's like that point from before that with Bandura, that you're not just affected by the world, you're also like in other people's mesosystems, right? You're in, or sorry, microsystems. Like it's like, just like I could draw this picture with me and everyone around me, my daughter could do that too, and I'd be in that circle, and my wife could do that and I'd be in that circle. And this is the wild thing of life, that like we're all the main character in our own movie, and we're more main or more minor characters in everyone else's movie. Mental film. You know, on my film, it's like my wife and my daughters are main characters, and so are my parents, and my students play like a cool role of like, you know, the focus of my work. And then I have my buddies, and you know, that's what I'll be remembering in my final days. That's my film. Okay, I don't know why I keep calling it film, and I'm stuck on that word for some reason. Okay, next slide. And then this is, you know, I have a kind of depressing point here, but this mesosystem idea, or the relationship between microsystems, or the connection between contexts, or like how what's happening at home affects what happens at school, and how what happens at school affects what happens at home. And see, that's like that's such like a hard thing to think of as a parent, because it's so true that like so often, even today, like my 7-year-old was like a little tougher today, just because for whatever reason she was just like wound up and in a wild mood, and it's so easy to just judge that as her behavior right now and not see how, like, I don't know, maybe she felt like uncomfortable at school today and kind of bottled it up and then like lets it out when she's home, which is like something kids totally do. But sometimes it's hard to keep that kind of perspective all the time, right? It's easy to just see people as what they're presenting as without the backstory. When we all know that especially if we're talking about like ourselves, we all know how much the backstory affects how we are feeling and acting. Children who have been rejected by their parents or have been neglected may have difficulty then forming relationships, right? Like it's like, and this is a tough topic, but like when the home life is rough, of course that translates to relationships outside the home, right? Not always, like there's examples where it doesn't, but it tends to. That's also why things like a coach that really cares about someone, or a really good teacher, or like a big brother or a big sister, like that organization, those things are so important. They're so important, and they save families, man. Because sometimes, and they save kids, because sometimes all a kid needs is one person that actually cares about them and actually is checking in on them. And it's like the protective effect that has is massive. And again, I said this a million times, but we'll be talking about that again in the course. Okay, so just these next two, the exosystem. So the exosystem, the links between the social settings where individual doesn't necessarily have an active role, right? So like think about, like my example there would be like, I'll just say even Nipissing, right? Say like for whatever reason I'm all stressed with something going on at Nipissing, and then that makes me be less patient with my child who has no idea why I'm stressed. To them, dad's just mad, right? And I try to control that. Like I'm using myself repeatedly as the example. I try not to be a terrible person. I try to be as decent of a person and dad and husband and everything as I can, teacher. But like I'm not perfect, obviously. Like, but you know, I think teaching about this stuff is helpful in the sense of you're obviously not perfect, but being and nor near it, and nor is that the goal, right? Freud's famous saying is that the good mother fails, and I think why that's an interesting saying is because what he means is like it might not even be best for your child for you to be perfect all the time. Like what does that mean? Like you're just like holding a fake image constantly. It's like the balance in parenting is well, the whole struggle, right? So anyways, I'm like, all of a sudden it's like I'm treating you like, I don't know, this microphone's a good listener. I'm like not trying to get all super deep, but it is interesting how like, or even this, say you're sitting here and you're like, oh my god, will this guy just get through the point? It's like, okay, well maybe you just had an argument with someone, or maybe you had a bad shift at work, and maybe you're not in the greatest mood, and maybe that's affecting how you're taking this right now. And it's like, it'd be almost crazy to think that that doesn't affect it. It's like everything that we bring to situations, it's like we're almost never completely neutral. We're almost always bringing energy. And I was talking about this with my class the other day we were talking about Freud, and I was talking about his big idea about displacement, right? That we take the energy from one place and put it on someone else. We take our bad mood from work and we let it interfere with our ability to have a nice conversation with our partner. And it's like, we have to be able to notice that, right? How much my buddy said that, I have a buddy who's a successful business guy, but he said during the pandemic with like the kids at home, like he would sometimes have to, before he would leave his office in his house, he would like stop in the doorway and almost just be like because everyone was like stressed to the nines, right? And he'd basically have to check himself in and be like, okay, I'm gonna be around my kids now. It's like I can't bring this like negative down energy around them. It's like almost like game time, go around the kids for a bit. And it's like, man, when he said that, I could totally relate. And so like the issue there is that the child just experiences that as a stressed parent. The child has like I'm not explaining to my kids all this backstory, right? Just like when they're older and they're teenagers, like, oh man, that's going to be a whole other issue. But then like when they're dealing with their own stuff and having difficulty maybe telling me, and then it just manifests or just looks from the outside as if it's like us not being in sync. And part of it is just we're underestimating how much the other person, and we're underestimating how much the other person and ourselves are bringing to the situation. And again, if this rant is worth anything, it's just to like warn you of that tendency of human beings to underestimate what they're bringing to the situation, and how much, and by what they're bringing to the situation, I just mean like kind of the mood and attitude you're in, and how much that shapes your in the moment experience. And then the macro system, the broader culture. I think I slipped in the word brainwashing earlier when I was talking about it, but it's like the message of the society at the time, you know, and it can be healthy or less healthy or more pathological. All right, one more. And then, you know, the chronosystem, and I have obviously a picture of, you know, the C word there, the pandemic causing virus. And it's like, that's something that every one of you will have a story that you'll tell your grandkids about. Hopefully not a multi-chaptered story, but hopefully a story that's behind us. And you lived through that time. And those were like the whole virus time period this last few years. Like, talk about a specific socio-historical event. It's something that everyone alive at this time period went through. Almost as much as anything ever is a socio-historical event. So just this point that, like, there's, to back up, there's you, then there's everything around you, then there's the interaction between all that, then there's like the broader society, the ecosystem, then there's like the even broader sort of reality of where you are. And reality isn't the right word, but the macro system, the attitudes and the ideologies of the culture, the meta narratives of your culture, the stories of your culture, and all that exists within a time period. So I just have a few more slides here. I like this Maslow quote, like, if you deliberately plan on being less than you're capable of being, then I warn you that you'll be unhappy for the rest of your life. That you actually, one of the most rewarding things for the human mind is that feeling of moving towards goals. That you, whether the goals are developing your mental health, whether the goals are strengthening your relationships or developing your career, whatever the goals are, that meaningful movement in the direction of your goals is actually sustaining. It's actually invigorating. And so Maslow, I'm going to talk about Maslow for a little bit here. So I know you've probably heard of Maslow, and probably heard of you've probably seen his pyramid, triangle, and all that. But I want to kind of contextualize this and like place it in history in your mind a bit as very much a response. Some people don't know about Maslow, that like he worked at the same was it University of either Madison or University of Milwaukee, or I don't know, I'm kind of freestyling right now because I think maybe even University of Madison is in Milwaukee. But anyways, he was studying at the same university as Harry Harlow, the guy that did the monkey experiments, and he actually worked a bit for Harlow. So it's just interesting how all this stuff connects. And so Maslow, a lot of his work is almost in a response or a reaction to the behavioralist and psychoanalytic approaches at the time. So although he was deeply influenced by the work of Freud and very interested in things like experimental psychology, like I mentioned, he like literally worked for Harlow, one of the most famous experimental psychologists or behavioralists. He thought that there was something like specifically related to humanness that couldn't be captured in animal experiments, and that was more than just our early experiences, that there were these, like, he later in his career is going to call this like self-actualization, or this idea of like becoming your full self, right? It's like if I say, oh, I got $1 million, and it's like I open the box and there's nothing in it, you're like, well, you don't actually have it. It's not actually there. It's not a real thing. To actualize means to become real, right? It's great to have potential, but can you make that potential become real? Can you actualize it, and can you self-actualize? Can you become the strongest version of you, right? That can you, I say, their holistic approach where it's focused on this idea of motivating people to intrinsically, meaning finding the motivation within themselves to reach towards self-improvement, to be motivated to be the best you can. This is like, and you can even see that it right in the name, humanistic approach. Now again, this is just as connected to social events as any of the other ones. This is during like the hippie times. This is during like Woodstock. This is part of a broader movement towards New Age and humanistic psychology in general, or philosophy in general. So Maslow not as much, but some of the other guys dabble a little bit in this whole New Age world. People like George Leonard, and Michael Murphy, like some of the guys at the Ellerstein Institute in Los Angeles, were about as hippie as it gets. But then some people like Maslow were much more scientists. Again, I hope you find these rants like somewhat interesting. It's like, I think that's what I can bring to the course. It's like my interest is kind of in the classical psychology, and how I think it's, still holds a lot of relevance. People like Maslow and Rogers, no one influenced counseling more than Rogers. Even the word counseling, even the word person-centered, or that. So like, just like Maslow thought about self-actualization, Carl Rogers' word was like fully functioning. That the goal is to become fully functioning, to get out of the way of the defense mechanisms, right? To develop the ability to have the deepest relationships you can. Develop the confidence to do well at work. Develop the ability, like all these things, so that you're functioning, you're actually performing at your full level, fully functioning. Like, so that's like his kind of idea. You can see how they're both based on this idea of there's something within you that needs to be fostered and developed and cultivated, and words like that. So I'm going to just do a couple minutes on this. So like, first of all, Maslow stressed this idea that we have physiological needs, like your body has needs, right? Like, whether it's like at the most base level of you need to breathe, right? You need to eat, you need to drink, you need to sleep, you need to go to the bathroom, because if you don't, you'll eventually get blood poisoning. It's like there's all these physiological needs, and Maslow says there's like this homeostasis disruption. It's like, when you don't feel at normal, you feel like, you're either, when it drops below a certain level, the idea is like you get thirst or hunger is your body's signal and this is kind of the idea, like thirst or hunger would be the example of like a physiological need. It's like an actual signal from your body that's motivating you towards a behavior. And you think about it, when you're hungry, it's like, did you choose in your brain that you're hungry, or are you responding to a physiological sensation from your gut? It's like obviously the second one. Sexual desire is also considered a physiological need, right? So again, Maslow not moving as far away from Freud as he thinks he is. Okay, next slide. So instead of just breaking down all the steps, because I'm sure you've been exposed to some of them, I wanted to kind of highlight this idea that at the deep conceptual level, he's basically saying there's some things that we need, in the sense that if we're lacking them, it makes us depressed and anxious and less stable. He called these deficiency needs, that these are needs that when not met, we become more vulnerable to anxiety and depression. So this is everything from physiological needs, like on the last slide, to things like physical needs around safety, and that safety is psychological too. For example, if you don't know if you're safe at home, it's really hard to work on things like self-esteem and self-actualization and these higher end things. That belongingness and feeling like you're accepted, and this idea of like feeling approval or feeling like you're actually valued by people. So these are deficiency needs. But then, so these are like, it's almost like two levels. There's one level of things that you need that if you don't have them, there's major negative psychological outcomes associated with that. But if those are all met, at least to a decent enough measure, then there's this next level of development that's possible. But the idea is that you're never getting to the growth needs if the deficiency needs aren't met. These higher order, or these being related, like that just means like, you say like well-being, or a human being, a being, like these like kind of growth needs. These, I don't know why, I think it's just because the textbook says being needs and the image I used from the internet says growth needs. It's the same word. It's the same thing. These higher order needs related to, finding your true self and finding your passions and all these kind of things that are like really hard to do if you're still battling with deficiency needs. So I just have 2 more slides for you, then I have a quick video, and then I'm going to wrap up. So if you could write this down for me, please. Positive psychology. So this is a more recent trend in psychology, and it's almost to the point where I would almost consider it like a 6th major subdivision of psychology. And this is largely the work of people like Martin Seligman, definitely, and Paul Wong, and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the guy that came up with the flow idea. And so the idea here is that for so long psychology is about like trying to fix what's wrong with people, and that it can be about more than that. That even though it can be super effective in helping people that are, the train's off the track for whatever reason, that need help getting back to quote unquote normal, that quote unquote normal is not the goal necessarily, that there's these higher levels of experience that you can actually help people learn to cultivate more positive emotion. And that's not the same as saying, oh, you should just be happy all the time, because maybe your life's hard. And maybe your wife's sick or something like that, or you have a sick kid and you're trying to take care of them, and maybe happiness isn't the goal in life. Maybe having something meaningful and sacrificing for something that to you matters more than anything else is what's meaningful. So positive emotions can be things like loyalty and courage and bravery, engagement, right? This means that like you can learn to develop your passions and your hobbies and even your professional work, if you're lucky enough into something that you can find rewarding, and that when you're engaged in it in that way, it has this like butterfly effect sort of on your mental health. And then all that exists within your world, and the quality of the relationships in that world are important also. And then this idea of like if you actually feel like your life has like a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose, this is all like basically 5 words. So you see the PERMA model, it's just like an acronym. And it's basically saying like, if you look at all these areas, these are the areas where you can help and work with people to improve, that improves your overall experience of life. And the last one I didn't do is accomplishment and achievement, that especially people that have maybe learned that they're helpless, it's like sometimes having even small achievements, even these little baby steps, if you've ever seen the movie What About Bob, these like baby steps towards, or these small steps towards things that are later going to be big steps. And that this focus on setting realistic, achievable goals so that you can keep the movement going forward, because it's based on a recognition that the movement going forward, it's what's important, even if the speed's slow, as long as you're, it's like the tortoise and the hare, little Aesop's fables for you. Okay, next slide. And then this last person I want to mention, and then as I kind of said, I'm going to show a video, and then I just have like a final like see you next week kind of slide. But yeah, Thielen, he has this interesting idea that actually that how we learn is this dynamic interaction between our physical development, our mental development, and that it's the interaction between the nervous system, the body, and the environment. And this is so wild, really, because it's interesting, because it's talking about how your nervous system is really the part of you that, if someone was to pinch your skin, the nervous system is what senses that. If you feel that you're cold, it's your nervous system that's sensing that. It's like your nervous system is in this almost communication with the outside world, and the world, I should have taken out the word almost. We literally call it the sympathetic nervous system. It's sympathetic to what's happening to you. And that this interaction between what we're feeling, like at that nervous system level, and how and our body and our environment and our brain, all are in this attempt to self-organize. It's a pretty wild theory, but it's interesting. He talks about this notion of phase transitions, that there's this point where it's like you can't do the thing yet. So like think about, say like my daughter when she was a little bit younger, my 2-year-old, when she was like a little bit younger and she was learning how to stand up, and it's like there was a point where she would like grab on something and then fall down, and there was a point where she would grab on something, be able to stand up a bit, and then maybe fall down, and then eventually she can just stand up. Eventually she's doing a completely new behavior. It's not that when she's standing up, it's not like she's just standing up more than she used to. It's like a little while ago she totally couldn't do that. And these phase transitions where there's this instability and this turbulence, her falling, her not being able to hold herself up, and first she can't do it at all, then she's in this like this unstable developmental period, this phase transition, and then all of a sudden she can do it and she's leveled up. And that there's this interaction between the environment, the person, and they're basically saying don't underestimate how physical development is and how much you are a body. Even though in psychology we like to talk about our minds. Your mind is in a body. You're embodied. I think that made that point. All right, final video, and then I'll check you next time. Hope you enjoyed this decently.
You are here, somewhere. You can't see you, it's too far away, but you're here somewhere. Maybe here, maybe here. You could be almost anywhere here, but you're definitely here. You don't know why or for what. No one does. All you know, all I know, is that you are somewhere here, magnetized to this strange, lushly coated wet rock, floating in its designated position of endless nothing. This rock you are on, it's tiny, and you are tiny compared to this rock. If we zoom out a little bit, look how tiny you are. Even further, tinier. You're so tiny, your even tinier brain can't comprehend how tiny you are. Your tiny self is posted up on this tiny rock surrounded by this dark, massive, unending space that could be anything and nothing at the same time. This rock will give you life. It will give you everything you need to live on its crust for a period of time. It might feel like a while, or it might feel like no time at all, depending on what mood you're in when you consider this idea. Regardless of how it feels to you, when compared to almost everything else, it will be so short. A single frame in a movie that never ends. A frame that could be removed and nothing would really change about the movie. In this frame, you will live on this rock, then you will die, and you will have no idea what happened. No one will. If you're really lucky, you'll have some friends and family and lovers who will be sad for a little while. They'll miss you, but they'll try really hard not to, because being sad and missing someone all the time is really tiresome. It'll mess up their lives, so they'll try to work through it and move on as best they can. They might go to therapy, they might practice techniques to get through grieving. They'll probably be somewhat successful. They will also die. If you're even more unusually lucky, you'll be missed and remembered for a little bit longer by a few more people. Perhaps you did something that impacted more people while you lived on this rock. Perhaps you were profoundly artistic, or smart, or a leader, or an inventor. When you die, perhaps more people will be sad for a little longer stretch of time. Most of these people would have never really known you though, so they won't think about you too much for too long either. And when they do, it'll mostly be a misconstruction of you based on their own ideals. They will all die. Over time, every person and every memory of a person will all die with each other. This won't matter. To you, to me, to anyone, we'll all be dead. The things you did, the words you said, the impacts you made, for good or for bad, big or small, they will all lose your name tag and will not matter to anyone or anything. So, whatever you're nervous about right now, whoever you're nervous because of, perhaps a first date, a job interview, a big presentation, an important test, a hard conversation, you might feel paralyzed with anxiety. You might feel like the course of your life is hinged on this coming moment, that the fate of reality is on your shoulders. It's not. You might be worried that you're going to do the wrong thing or fail. You might, but everything will be okay. Because for some reason, against all conceivable odds, you're on this weird rock, this planet that births life, life that births more life, novel life, intelligent life, you. In this unknowable vacuum of potential nihility, you have this playground, this consciousness, this capacity for wonder, emotion, and thought. The only real mistake you can make is to not recognize this. To never relax and enjoy the hilarious and enthralling absurdity of it all. To realize that it all means nothing beyond itself, and to find freedom and inspiration in this thought. To explore and connect with what it can mean to be a you on a rock, in a solar system, in a galaxy, in a universe, in a who knows what. To be kind and decent. To have fun, to love, to laugh, to cry, to try, to fail, to live. And to remember that no matter whatever happens, you can still do all of this. No matter what you do in life, worst case is you try your best, you be yourself, and you do what you can do with compassion, honesty, effort, and understanding. And it goes worst case. And then you move on, like everything else.
Thank you for watching. If you found enjoyment and value in this video, please give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you are not already, be sure to subscribe to our channel. We are constantly coming out with new videos to help you experience life with clarity and wonder.
I hope you enjoyed the first presentation. That was just to get you to think a little bit. The Pursuit of Wonder video is, I like that channel. I think that it's super interesting. It's not, I'm not trying to be preachy to you, but sometimes it is really useful to stand back and be like, this whole thing that we're doing as humans is like pretty amazing when you think about it from certain perspectives. And spending all our time here stressing about stuff is, if it can be prevented, and if that energy can be put towards your loved ones and towards focusing on things you find fascinating, it's like the more of that, the better. I said this already, I think, but I hope you enjoyed the class, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.